Be good to go. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not worried about it being perfect there, as long as you can get the CASA message to disappear. Thank you. Is there any way to get that message off the screen?
If we could go ahead and get seated. Some of us, let's get in our seats, please.
All right, that'll work. Thank you. Oh no, it's perfect. Thank you.
Miss Reese, if you want to move your staff, we've got some spots over here so you can see.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Want to make sure that everybody can see the screen to the degree that they can.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we're good. Is the screen good now? You ready?
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Need a break?
We're good.
All right. Good morning. Again. Well, we are very fortunate to have Will Parker with us, not only today, but he was here in June as well, and many of our educators had the opportunity to participate in a workshop that he offered really on self-care and on how we care for ourselves so that we can care for others. And I came to know Will through podcast as a principal. He has a podcast, Principal Matters. He's written a number of books and guided me through my work as a principal and an educator before I even moved into the Archdiocese. And even after that, have continued to listen to podcasts, read his books, and learn so much and that can inform me in my growth as an educator. His latest book, you can tell I've dog-eared it to death, but it's called Pause, Breathe, Flourish. And we have a number of copies actually in the back. If you're desire to pick one up and take it with you, you can. But again, just a real timely resource for us given the challenges and circumstances that we faced and may continue to face moving forward. So Will has flown in from Oklahoma. He's going to tell you a little bit about his background. Wasn't easy getting here, but Will, we're so delighted not to have you just once this summer, but twice. And again, welcome to Louisville.
Yeah, well, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Superintendent Dr. Mary Beth Bowling. I'm so privileged to be with you all this morning, and as Mary Beth explained, my work now as an educator is helping educators and school leaders across Oklahoma. And through my podcast, I've had the opportunity to interview educators across the world. And so I would just invite you later to connect. I want to make sure this is a conversation that continues. I'm the father of 4 children. My wife and I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We've been married for 28 years. We have 3 college-age daughters and a son who's going into high school as a sophomore this coming year. And I began my journey as an educator in 1993 as a high school language arts teacher just south of Tulsa in a school called South Intermediate High School in Broken Arrow. I taught language arts. I taught mythology as an elective. I taught creative writing. I taught AP language. Later, I became the department chair for the English department. And then in 2004, I stepped into my first role as a school administrator, as an assistant principal in a school just south of Tulsa. And then in 2006, I moved to a school north of Tulsa, Skiatook High School, where I was principal until 2017. And so in the 24 years that I had as a teacher and a principal, I had the privilege to serve students in our communities. I want to tell you a little bit about my last school because this is where my 2 oldest graduated. Skiatook is located in 2 counties. If you ever come to Oklahoma, please come to Tulsa and go just north and you land in what's called Osage County. I'm really curious if anyone's ever heard of Pioneer Woman. You ever heard of her? Some of you have. Well, she lives in Osage County, and Osage County is an Indian reservation. We were one of only 2 schools in the state of Oklahoma that offered Osage as a foreign language. And so 32% of our students are Native American. We had a diverse population with a lot of tradition and legacy. There's a new movie being made in Osage County that's called Killers of the Flower Moon with Leonardo DiCaprio. And so I just encourage you, when that movie comes out, go see it. You're going to be, I think, enthralled by the story of that area. And I think you'll be challenged, too, at how often the systematic injustices that we've seen in the past, we often can see reflected in history. And it makes us wonder, what are we going to be looking back at 50 years from now and wondering, or 100 years from now, wondering what we have been living through and experiencing here that we're not even aware of. And so many of my students and families live in that area and in that culture, and I just invite you to please come visit if you ever get to Oklahoma. When I fly, there is always a flight attendant who stands up and gives instructions as we're getting ready to go, and I have to admit that now that I'm flying more frequently, I often just tune them out. I put them in my earbuds and start falling asleep or wear my mask. But there's always a point when the flight attendants announce this that I pay a little more attention. When they say, if the cabin loses pressure, an oxygen mask will drop down above your heads. First, place it on yourself, and then assist the person next to you. And when I hear that flight attendant say that, it reminds me of an experience that I had in the first couple of years when I transitioned from teaching into school administration. I had come home late one night after a long day at school and a full day of school activities and an evening full of ball games. And when I came home at that time, our children, all 4 of them, were really small. And I was there just in time to help put them to bed. And as they were going to sleep, I sat down at the table and I opened my laptop to do what I was doing every evening, which was to work late into the night to catch up on all my emails and get ready for the next day and set my priorities and make sure that I had gone through all my follow-through. I would wake up early the next morning, sometimes at 3 or 4 or 5 a.m., depending on how much work I had to do the next day, so I could be completely prepared to step into that day, ready to go. I would hit the ground running to make sure that I could answer questions and be helpful, and I would skip lunch because that's what you do, right? When you're a great educator, you power through, and you skip lunch, and you do all the things that you need to do to make sure that you're meeting the needs of kids, and that you're answering the phone calls of parents, and that you're responding to the needs of those around you. Because I wanted to be the kind of educator that I had always dreamed of having as a kid, and that I'd always dreamed as a teacher of having a principal who could respond to all my needs. But that night, when my wife sat down with me at the table, she said, "Will, can we have a conversation?" And so I shut my laptop, and she said something to me that was so important. She said, "Will, the kids and I have decided that you are a dad and a husband on the weekends only. The rest of the time, the school owns you. And frankly, you have become a shell of the man that you used to be. She didn't say it with bitterness or resentment, just simple resignation. And she was right. And that night, instead of working into the wee hours, I opened my laptop back up and I wrote a letter of resignation. I explained to my superintendent and to my board that my position was going to have to be changed because of my inability to serve both my family and the school. And I printed that letter and I took it to my office and I placed it in a folder and I set it on the desk. And here's what I told myself. I'm either going to begin to discover new priorities and habits so that I can take care of myself and family and my school, or at the end of this year, I'm handing in this letter. And every single day, when I would step into that office, I would look at that letter and I would ask myself that question: what am I going to do today to make sure that I'm taking care, that I'm breathing first so that I can help others breathe? 7 years later, I was standing on the stage in Washington, D.C. with my wife, who was in an evening gown, and I was wearing a tux, and my kiddos were in their Sunday bests. And I was being recognized as Oklahoma's Assistant Principal of the Year. And that's not an honor I'm saying for my own ego. That's a celebration for my school. But I recognized that evening that recognition was only possible because of the conversation I had at that table that night. And the reason I'm bringing that story to you first, as you're getting ready to jump into this school year, is because after 25 years of doing this work, when I work with teachers and when I work with students and parents and educators, especially when I'm working with those of us in this field of service where we want to give and serve and help, the one question that keeps coming back to me more often than any other is, how do I keep from burning out? How do I keep myself motivated for the work that I'm going to do? And folks, this year, I'm so sorry that this year is going to require resilience and challenge just like last year did. I was as excited as you were 3 weeks ago, thinking, here we go. We're getting ready to jump in. We're getting ready to start school. We're going to be able to have those masks off every single day and just do what we love to do. And here we are facing challenge again. And so today, I want to call you first to think about how can you stay invested in those areas of your own practice in life, reflecting on all of those areas, even outside of school, so that you can stay inspired and creative in the work you're going to be doing in this difficult year. So there's 10 areas that we will not have time to talk about in this short session that we have together, but I just want to show them to you and invite you to grab a copy of the book on your way out. There's a limited number, but please reach out if you are interested in a copy. But they are the following. How are you investing in your body? I grew up on a farm and my grandparents raised a garden every spring, and I got to stand in my bare feet as my granddad would dig the holes and put the fertilizer in and plant the tomatoes and cover them and water them. And as I watched them nourish that bounty, I realized gardening isn't just happenstance. You cultivate and you care. How are we doing that with our bodies? Are we taking time with nutrition and sleep and exercise to make sure that we are taking care of our gardens so that we can be present to take care of others? How are you taking care of your mind? What's on your mental playlist? My daughter has a playlist that she always keeps on her iPhone that when we're in the car together, she puts in because she knows there's songs that I like too. She calls it Dad's playlist. And so as I listen to those songs, sometimes I have to ask myself the question, what am I putting into my mental playlist? What am I listening to? What am I reading? What am I meditating on? Because you know what you place in your mind is eventually going to sink into your heart and it's going to come out through your actions. So what are you placing into your mental playlist this year? How are you investing in your influence? How are you making sure that when you step in a room, you add something to the conversation, not pull the energy out of someone else's dreams and ideas? How are you reflecting on the use of your time? And this is probably the biggest challenge for all of us as educators, is making sure that we make the most of each moment. But you know, I'm in my 50s, which means I've lived approximately 20,000 days. You want to do the math real fast on yourself? How many more days do I have left? And how am I making sure that I'm making the most of each of them so that I can live without regret? How am I investing in my friendships? Because those relationships that we have with one another, those friendships they're the foundation. They're the place we fall when difficult things happen. And if we're investing ourselves in our work, but we're neglecting those around us who are going to help us through difficult times or celebrate with us through the good times, then we're missing out on an essential part of our growth. How are we nourishing ourselves spiritually? What a beautiful service this morning to be together to begin a school year by reminding ourselves that our faith is the foundation of the service and the calling that we have as educators. How are you utilizing your resources? And let me be frank. If our lives back home are out of control in terms of our stewardship and our generosity, our ability to manage our finances, if we're not able to do those things with peace of mind, it's really hard to show up and take care of other people when that anxiety is weighing on us all the time. How are we investing in our intimacies? Those most intimate relationships, whether you're married or you have close friendship or you have a dear grandchild, how are you investing in those most intimate relationships? Because those are the people who you are going to be reaching out to. Someday when we all have that moment where we're glimpsing our last days on earth, we will not care how many emails we answered, but we will care about people. How are we providing others with stronger focus by also taking time to think about our futures, giving ourselves permission to dream about a year from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, giving ourselves permission to take action on those things that are passions and gifts that God's given us. And then finally, are we taking time to reflect on our legacy? What do you want others to say about you when you're gone? Because believe it or not, someday your school is going to operate without you. I know that's hard to believe, but it will. And so what kind of legacy do you want to leave? Last night, in fact, I was in Dallas and I was stepping out of the airplane and this young lady stopped me, this beautiful African-American girl, and she said, and I had a mask on and she did too, and she goes, "Is that Mr. Parker?" You guys have had that experience, haven't you? And what do you do every time you see a former student? You lie. You're like, "Oh, it's so good to see you," and you act like you remember who they are, and I've had like 2,000 of you by now. And so I was like, "Oh, it's so good to see you," and I'm trying so hard to remember when I had her. And so she was kind enough to tell me that she lives in Atlanta and she owns 4 Airbnbs and Bs, and that she remembered when I was her principal. And so that helped me figure out which school. And she said something to me that surprised me. She said, you were an important influence in my life. Thank you." And I seriously walked away from that conversation wondering, how was I an important influence in her life when I can't even remember her name? But you are an important influence in the lives of so many people. Whether you remember their names when they walk up to you later from now or 10 years from now or 2 days from now, the opportunity that you have right now to step into your classrooms and into your buildings and influence the lives of young men and women who you will never know how or why you influenced and inspired them is powerful. Maslow's hierarchy, we talk about this as educators all the time. And usually we remind ourselves as educators that we have to begin with the needs of kids first. What are their physical needs? Make sure that they can eat and drink. Make sure that they feel safe. Make sure that they feel loved and secured, and which leads, of course, to stronger self-identity and self-actualization. And that's usually where we stop. When I was getting my bachelor's and master's degrees in education, that's all I knew of Maslow's was up to self-actualization, the highest point of existence. But if you look at Maslow's later research, he added transcendence. Why would he do that? Why would he add transcendence to the top of that pyramid? And the reason is because he realized as he aged, like a lot of us do, that if our experience with life, if the ultimate peak of our existence is our own self-awareness, man, that's limited. I don't want my experience of life to be based just upon my own self-awareness, because You have experiences of life that I want to understand, that help me understand life better. People who've lived before us have experiences that I want to understand so that I can understand life better. There's an eternal perspective. There are timeless truths that we can lean on that give us a bigger picture of all of time and creation. And of course, as people of faith, you realize that transcendence points you towards a creator. So these are those 10 areas that I cover in the book, but I just want you to reflect on these for a moment. Your body, your mind, your influence, your time, your friendships, your spirituality, your resources, your intimacy and future and legacy. And those of you that are joining virtually, I don't know which camera I'm talking to either, but thank you. If you're paying attention to this, I know you can't see the screen, so I'm willing and happy to share this PowerPoint with you later if you want to reach out to me, and I'll share my email address with you. But here's some questions that I want to ask you guys, and I'm going to just pretend this is a classroom for a moment, so we're going to have some elbow partners, all right? So here's some questions to reflect on. In this school year or in the past, have you ever struggled with placing an oxygen mask on first? Does that story resonate with you? Do you have someone who can hold you accountable? Have you ever felt like a shell of yourself? In what ways are you committing to investing outside of work so that you can stay inspired for the work you're doing? And of those 10 areas, which of those are the most difficult, do you feel like, or the most neglected by you right now? So pick a question and reach over to an elbow partner, and let's just take a couple of minutes and talk. Ready, set, go. You listen to what?
True crime podcast. I promise I won't become a serial killer. But I should probably work on it.
Wrap it up in 1 minute. Let's pull back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I was listening into a conversation. What is your name? I was listening to a conversation, and Amanda said, I listen nonstop to true crime podcasts. What is in my mental playlist? And she said, I promise I will not murder anyone. I love that. When you look at that list together, let me just say this on the front end, just to alleviate any anxiety that this conversation might be creating. Because when I go through that list, I get anxious. Because I start thinking about all those things that I'm not doing right now that I should be doing, or all those other areas that I may be neglecting that I should not be neglecting. In fact, when I wrote this book, I started this book in 2017 and didn't finish it until during the pandemic. The pandemic forced me to finish this book. And as I was wrapping it up with the publisher and editing it, it was so challenging to go back through a book that I had written about each of these areas and realize which of those areas where I had grown and which of those areas I had gone backwards. And so I want to alleviate the stress by telling you that balance is not possible. Okay? Is that all right? balance is not possible. And so for people to talk about work-life balance and figuring out that thing, I want to come back to the garden analogy. These areas of your lives are ones that you revisit and you reflect on consistently so that you can consistently come back and figure out, where do I need to grow or go next? And so please alleviate the anxiety and give yourself permission not to be perfect. Give yourself permission to give yourself the kind of grace you want to give other people, but also give yourself permission to grow. And so today I'm going to only have time to focus on 3 of these areas with you. I want to talk about influence and friendships and legacy, just as areas to reflect on with you as you step into this new school year. And I want to begin by first talking about your influence. In 2010, I had the opportunity to go with a group of students to China. What an amazing trip. And if you've never been able to travel with students overseas, put that on in your bucket list for something to do before you finish this profession. But we spent time in 4 cities for 2 weeks across that amazing country. And I like to run. So one morning I got up early before the kids and I put on my shoes, and we were staying in a city, and I decided to get out and do a quick jog before the day, and then we pulled together for breakfast. But all through the day, I felt bad. I felt like I was catching a cold. Something was wrong. I wasn't breathing as well as I would have liked. And it wasn't until the next day when we packed up and headed out of the city, and I saw the skies turn blue, and I realized, as I was looking back at where we'd come from, how polluted the city was that we were in, that I recognized that I had been running through a city that was incredibly polluted. I was trying to be healthy, but filling myself with toxins. And I tell you that story for this reason. How many times when we step into our schools, our classrooms, or other conversations, are we bringing something positive to that conversation, or are we bringing toxins into that conversation? In this time that we live in right now, with all of the cultural and political differences and how quickly people become outraged, I just want to encourage you to choose what kind of influence you're going to be. Make that choice. You can't choose what other people's attitudes and behaviors are, but you can choose yours. And I want to tell you a quick story as an example of how I've seen others be positive influences in my own family. And 7 years ago, my son Jack was diagnosed with a rare disease called Kawasaki. Has any of you ever had a student or a child with Kawasaki? It is usually small children. Jack was a little older than the average age, but it attacks the blood cells in your body, and if it's untreated, it can lead to heart damage or it can lead to death. And when Jack was diagnosed with Kawasaki, he had this horrible rash. He was feverish. He was at the point where he was, the morning that we realized, even though we had thought it was strep throat and they'd given him antibiotics, he woke up one morning and he couldn't walk. And so we rushed him to the emergency room, and they tried to figure out what was going on. And a young intern doctor thought this might be Kawasaki. So he sent us to a children's hospital in Tulsa. And Jack spent 2 weeks in that hospital. The first 2 days, they tried these antibiotics, these high doses of antibiotics that would bring down his fever, but he actually went into septic shock. So they had to pull him off the antibiotics. And we didn't realize until looking back how close we were to losing him to this crazy disease that just happened. And over the 2 weeks that I sat in the hospital room, and this was when I was a school principal, so my team and teachers were back taking care of all the things that they needed to do while I was sitting there realizing that school could wait now because my son's health was on the line. My wife and I watched as these medical professionals saved his life. And as I sat there, there were several things that came to mind about Jack's care. And just in case you're wondering, here he is now. Jack is, this was last summer, we went climbing in Utah together in the La Salle Mountains. Hiking is his favorite thing. And he does not have any after effects. But we were afraid. And as the doctors and nurses figured out what was going to be necessary for his cure, there were several things that I recognized about the community that was caring for him. And I want you to apply this for a moment to your work in your schools. Number one, Jack was surrounded by a group of people who had a common goal. They were a diverse community of people. The interns, the doctors, the nurses, the technicians, even the people who cleaned his room. They were all different kinds of people, different genders, different races, some international that had moved in to help. They were from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, but you know what? They were united around one thing, and that was the care for the kids on that floor. And it was amazing to watch them stay united around that one goal. Number two, each of them knew their roles and executed them well. In other words, the technician who was drawing blood was not trying to do diagnoses. And the nurse who was trying to bring Jack down Jack's fever was not doing prescriptions. And the doctor who was prescribing and figuring out what things were going to happen was not trying to do the job of the custodian or the technician. Each person knew their jobs and those roles, and they executed them well. And number three, they combined both care and reaching their goals together. I want you to pause for just a moment and ask yourself, how does this remind you of a healthy classroom or healthy school? Because the influence that these folks had on Jack's care reminded me that these are the same qualities that make strong educators too. As you think about your influence going into this school year, I do want to pause for just a moment for a reality check, because 2021 was a year like no other I've ever seen. And I would have said a couple of months ago, like no other we'll ever see again. But I'm not so sure that's true anymore. If you look at the history of the Spanish flu, the pandemic that hit 100 years ago, it took 3 years before the variants of that virus finally ran their course around the globe. And so I'm not saying that to discourage us at the prospects ahead of us, but I want to give us a reality check that we may be in this for the long run. So the relationships that you have, be careful not to burn bridges. Those who are frustrating you or in some cases angering you because they may be making decisions that may be contrary to what you think is important or what you think is a priority. Choose right now to practice forgiveness, because 10 years from now you may both look back at this whole situation differently. But ask yourself this question: what can I do today and tomorrow when I step into my school to be that person that's welcoming, that's caring, that's executing the mission that I have before me? Because you faced a lot of challenges this year. Teacher and staff exhaustion, remember how tired you were at the end of last year? Decision fatigue, remember how often you had a plan, and then what happened to the plan? It changed, and then what happened the next day? It changed. And so decision fatigue was something I've never seen educators that had to shift more and pivot more than they did last year, and that may be the situation this year too. Credibility being questioned. I don't know how many times I've talked to teachers and principals and superintendents and board members who just felt beat up and felt like their own credibility, their own integrity as a person was being questioned, to the point of a lot of them considering resignation or retirement. We saw a lot of new teachers turned over in our areas. And then, of course, why we all do this work: instruction and practice, unfinished learning, the fact that often teaching took a back seat to everything else. And so those are real pressures, and they may be pressures that you're facing again. But I also saw some common lessons from this that I believe a lot of educators are holding on to so that they can stay positive influencers stepping into this new school year. And so these are some reflections that I've heard from others as I've talked to educators across my state and across the country. Number one, you can do hard things. You've proven that. You and your students and your community members are more resilient than you knew. And I just want to tell you, if you haven't heard it already, congratulations and thank you for your resilience. My hope was that as we stepped into this year, that would be a conversation of celebrating in the past, but it's still present, and it's going to be what carries us forward no matter if this pandemic is short or long term. 2, relationships still matter more than ever. At the end of the day, it's trust that's going to get us through. And so taking in the opportunity to Stay connected with your peers, to reach out to the teacher down the hall, to check in on your principal, to make sure that your parents know that you care and that those students realize that when they step into your room, you are as excited to have them there on that first day as you will the last day. Those relationships matter. 2 or 3, strong instructional practice transcends time and place. And let me pause and explain what I mean by that. How many of you had to do some pivoting last year and do some virtual teaching? Anybody have that experience? Yeah. That's not easy, is it? But here's what we learn is that those strong instructional practices that you do in the classroom, they don't always translate, but they do transcend. And so don't give up on what you know is strong pedagogy. Don't give up on what you know is research-based good best practices, because those things still work. They may have to be pivoted and changed sometimes. There may be a gap in learning because of kids being in or out, but stay committed to the practices that you know work. And then finally, I am committed to this idea that teachers and students and communities, they need strong leadership. And as classroom teachers, you are instructional leaders for your students and administrators in here. Teachers need good and strong support. When you look at the research on the highest determining factor of student success in school, do you know who that person is? I'm sure you're aware of the research. It's the quality of their teacher. Hands down. And if you want to see the research later, I'm happy to show it to you. Hands down, the highest determining factor of outcomes in student learning. And I'm not talking about home life. I'm talking about student learning in school is the quality of their teacher. But you don't want to know what the second highest determining factor of the outcomes of student learning are in that building? The quality of their administrator or their school leaders. So you can't do one without the other. It has to be a partnership. So how are we moving forward? How do we look at this challenge of influence and move forward as positive influencers? Well, I just want to offer some suggestions. I want to encourage you to think as you're stepping into this year about more than just your practice, but all the things that are involved in that practice too. And there's several things I just want to encourage you to think about. Number 1, consider being a mentor. You veteran teachers who may down the hall have a younger teacher who's stepping in, they need your input. And so even though you may close that door and be the person who's an instructional expert in your room, other people need your mentorship. 2, stay committed to servant leadership. That means when something needs to be done, we're all willing to roll up our sleeves and help. I've mopped many hallways in a tie, or jumped into the cafeteria line when the cafeteria ladies the line was getting too long and they just needed someone to help to serve. And you've done that too. And so staying committed to serving, and not just serving ourselves, but serving others, is a part of that influence. Be willing to lead by example. When you see something that needs to be done, don't wait for somebody else to do it. You do it first. And that becomes a positive infection around the school. Stay committed to your teaching. And I'm saying this not only to those of you that have so many other responsibilities that sometimes teaching seems like the last thing you get to, but make sure that instruction stays the focus. But also for you school administrators, our call, because I was both in the classroom and out, our call as school administrators is also to be willing to jump in and teach too, and model those practices, and stay up to date ourselves on what we know is good instruction. Number 5, build platforms. You have the opportunity as the caretakers of your students to broadcast to your parents and community members the things that are happening in your school like nobody else does. When I was a young boy, my father would set up a telescope outside our farmhouse in West Tennessee, and we could look at the stars. If you've ever seen constellations in complete darkness, it's mesmerizing. And sometimes we would look at the craters of the moon. But you science teachers know that there's only one face of the moon that's visible to the earth. No matter if I'm in China or in Kentucky, I can only see one side of the moon, and only can you. And the only way you can see the other side of the moon is if you do what? Become an astronaut, okay, or watch it through a satellite. As educators, guess what? You see more of the moon of your school experience than your parents and community members do. And that gives you both a privilege and a responsibility to share what you're seeing. So take advantage of that platform to broadcast out those wonderful moments that you're capturing with those kids. Take time to pause when great things are happening and jot down a note to yourself or remind yourself, I'm going to stick that in my newsletter, or I'm going to take a photo of this moment and then share that back out. Because when there's a void of information about what's happening at your school, people imagine and determine for themselves what's happening. And most of the time it's wrong. And so when we begin to have negative perceptions of what's happening in our schools, often it's because we're not telling them what's happening in our schools. So be committed to building a platform where you can consistently be sharing with others the great things happening. And then finally, this is a quote that I took from John Gordon, who wrote a book called The Energy Bus. And John Gordon works with a lot of sports teams. And he tells coaches, you know that on your team there's always what he calls the energy vampire. The person, when you decide this is going to be the next thing that we're working on as a team and we're all going to rally around this new play, and you got that one player that's like, that's not going to help. I don't want to do that. And so his challenge when he flips that narrative is, in whatever environment you're in work or in school, are you an energy vampire or are you an energy builder? In fact, John Gordon said one time that a coach friend of his put a picture of a vampire in the locker room, and whenever a player started getting really negative, he would write his name beside the vampire so that the kids would know, I don't want my name up there, I better change my attitude. I do not suggest you do that. Okay? I do not suggest you do that. So take just a moment and reflect. I'm sorry, I should have widened the screen. Who would you consider some of your bigger influencers? Think back to the people who have brought positivity to your experience. Who were they? And then how can you be that to someone else? Number 2, right now, would you consider your influence toxic or refreshing? And how often do you evaluate or acknowledge how you're influencing those around you? Or 3, which of those areas that I mentioned do you relate to or do you want to grow in? Mentoring, servant leadership, being an example, teaching others, or building platforms. So let's take another moment and grab your elbow partner, and I want you to think about someone who's positively influenced you in your work as an educator, who they are and why they influenced you. Let's tell those stories. Ready, set, go. How are we doing on time?
11:30, right on target. Somehow, some way, the tech came together and we got going. So.
One more minute. All right. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Stand up for just a moment, please. Because you guys know, you're educators, right? What happens if you sit too long? I want you to take your left hand, put it in the air, and reach over and touch your right earlobe. Can you do that? If you're wearing earrings, you can check to make sure you haven't lost one. All right, take your right hand now, put it up in the air, and reach over and touch your left ear. Good, because you guys know what brain science says, right? Now turn to someone near you and say, "You are awesome," and give them a high five. All right, you may be seated. You can sit down now. A couple of years ago, my wife showed me a book she was reading by Chantel Nelson. It was a book on how to have great girlfriend relationships. I'm not recommending it because I didn't read it. But she showed me a chapter. It was actually while I was working on this book, and it was so intriguing. But Chantel Wilson mentions a piece of research from 2008. I don't know how researchers get grant money to do this, but these researchers had taken time to pull all these individuals together and study levels of anxiety. And one of the tests that they did was they would place a person in front of a large incline, a hill, and they would ask them to estimate how long it would take for them to climb that incline. And so they would notate the length that they thought the incline was or how long they were going to do that. So they ran a study with people being asked that question individually. And then they ran a second study where they had that person ask that question with a friend or someone close to them standing beside them. And guess what they discovered? And this was why the research was significant. And I don't have the numbers, but I can reference it. It's in the book if you want to reference the research. Well, what they discovered was that the amount of time that it would take to climb the incline significantly decreased when someone was standing by you. When I heard that research, I thought that is so powerful, because how often as educators do we pride ourselves sometimes in our independence and isolation, and we forget that we climb better with others. Your friendships, they matter, and they matter in your workplace, they matter outside of work, but knowing that you're linking arms with others always helps you climb better. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. How many of you guys love Tolkien? Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or C.S. Lewis's work, The Chronicles of Narnia. I love C.S. Lewis. You know, those guys were friends, and they were in a group together that would often gather around literature and drinks, and they would talk about life and philosophy and religion. And they had a mutual friend whose name was Charles Williams. And when Charles Williams died, Lewis wrote a letter to J.R.R. Tolkien. And he said in that letter something that I read, and it made me pause. He said to Tolkien, "Now that Charles has died, there will be parts of you that I will never see again, and parts of me that you will never see again." And it made me pause because it made me realize that your relationships with others bring out parts of you that you cannot discover on your own. That's beautiful. But it's also inspiring to think about why it matters that we stay connected. Because there are parts of you that other people need that are not visible until you're in community. And so this year I want to encourage you, as you're stepping back into school, to not give up on staying connected. One of the biggest mistakes that I made in those years that I told you, the drought that I went through professionally, was I was so committed to the work. I had stopped eating lunch with friends. I was just running all the time. And so one of the first commitments I made with some of my colleagues was that I was going to eat lunch again. I know that sounds like a big deal, but it's what I said. I was going to start eating lunch again with friends. So to pull together with other colleagues and at least have conversation, to laugh together, to talk about kids, to gossip. all those things that you get to do when you reconnect. And so I just want to encourage you that accountability makes a huge difference. Another decision that I made that required accountability was to leave my office and my school so I could spend time with my family. And so one of my colleagues, I confided in her, another administrator, that this was where we were, that my wife and I were struggling with my balance. And so she would stop by my office on her way out of the building every day and say, Will, your kids need you more than the school. Go home now. And it worked because the mutual accountability provided me with a measure of strength I didn't have on my own. And so I just want to encourage you to think about these things as you consider your friendships this year. How can you be committed to mutual accountability? How can you stay committed to the life support that happens within community? Because you need one another. You have families that have struggled and suffered because of the loss of a loved one through COVID. And I would say that everybody in this room knows someone at this point who has suffered. We lost a mother this week in our community, the same age as my wife, with 3 high school students at home. How do you make it through that? You make it through that with the life support of the others around you who love you. Your friendships provide you opportunities for reflection, which means that good friends listen. We take the opportunity sometimes not to always give advice, but just to be present. And then friendships provide us the opportunity to be better versions of ourselves, but also to bring out the best in others too, and to call them back to the best that's in them too. So I just want to encourage you with this story. Charlie Plumb was a Navy captain who flew dozens of missions from the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk during the Vietnamese War, and he was flying a mission when he was shot down and captured and imprisoned in a Vietnamese concentration camp for 6.5 years. And I became aware of Charlie's story because one morning I came into school and a student had left me a note on my desk. When I opened it up, it was this story about Charlie Plumb, who was shot down, who had been placed in a concentration camp, and then after the war was over, he had come back to his small town, and as he was reconnecting with his family and recovering from the trauma, one night he was at dinner when an older gentleman stepped up to his table and he said, "Excuse me, sir, are you Captain Plumb?" And Charlie stood up and said, "I am." And the man said, "You probably don't know me, but I was a sailor on the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk, and I packed your parachute." And Charlie grabbed him by the hands, and he was like, I've thought many, many times, who was the person who packed that parachute that saved my life when I came down? And the guy said, "Well, how did it work?" And he goes, "Well, one of the panels broke, but otherwise it saved my life." So they exchanged pleasantries, and that night Charlie Plumb went home, and he couldn't sleep, and he got up and he wrote the story I'm telling you right now. And he said, "I asked myself the question, how many times had I walked on the platform of that ship, on the deck of that ship, and donned my captain's uniform and felt proud of my position as a pilot, but never once had I gone into the bowels of that ship to see who was packing my parachute. How many people did I say that I never thanked for the work that they were doing that made my work possible?" And the reason I wanted to pause here was to ask you the same question. Who's packing your parachute? Somebody's doing it right now at the school. Somebody's been helping you in your life outside of school. There are people sitting here in this room right now who've packed parachutes for you in different ways too. And as you step into this school year, I think it's important for us to stay connected to those relationships and to take a moment to say thank you. So I'm going to ask you to do something you don't let your kids do. I'm going to ask you to pull out your cell phones for just a moment. Go ahead. Technology time. Woo! Pull out your cell phones. You think I'm joking? Find your cell phone. I want you to open up your cell phones if you have one. If you don't have one, then congratulations on your commitment to balance. I want you to think of somebody who's packed your parachute, it's been a while since you said thank you. And I want just 30 seconds. I just want you to compose a quick little message of, "Hey, just thinking about you. Thank you for whatever that is, fill in the blank." So I'm going to be quiet, and I want you to just send a quick thank you to somebody who's packed your parachute. Can you do that? Ready? Go. you've pushed send, just lift a hand so I can see who's actually accomplished the mission. As you're finishing up those messages, I want you to, when you get that response back here in just a little bit, if I see a hand go up, then I'm going to realize somebody's responding back to you. There's a reason I wanted you to practice that too while you're finishing this up, and that's because how long did it take you right now to positively influence someone else? How long did that take? About 30 seconds. I read a lot and I do a lot of research on school improvement because I get to work with teachers and educators, and sometimes the research can be overwhelming because schools that show significant student growth academically, often it takes 3 to 5 years of like collaborative work and everyone sharing the same goals and missions and moving towards that goal. And that collaborative work takes a lot of time and investment. And those of you that are stepping into a school that maybe is shifting or growing in different ways, you might be looking down the long road and thinking, man, this may take a while for us to reach these goals. Or maybe you're on a trajectory with a school that's already at that point and you want to make sure you stay committed to that. But it only takes sometimes 1 minute to positively change the people or influence the people that are around you. So don't let the long-term goals distract from the short-term opportunity that you have to be a positive influence. This is a picture of me when I was 6 years old. I tried to find a cute one. I grew up in Northwest Tennessee, and my family, who you can't see in this photo because of how far away you are, but my mom and dad have 6 children. And in this photo, there was just 5 of us at the time and my grandmother. We were moving when Dad got out of the Navy back to Northwest Tennessee. My mom and dad both grew up in Tennessee. My father dropped out of high school when he was 17 years old and joined the military. My mother graduated from high school and never went to college. And when Dad left the military and came back to Northwest Tennessee, we moved back to the farm where my grandparents lived. And Dad worked lots of odd jobs. He was an electrician. He was a maintenance man for our school. Later, he finished his military career and then started his own business as a small business owner of a marine salvage business. And it wasn't until I went to college and left home and was in my first teaching position and was helping figure out which of my kids were filling out all the forms for enrollment. And you may or may not do this at your school, but we had kids who would qualify for free and reduced lunches. And I suddenly realized that's me. All through my elementary school and junior high and high school years, we always qualified for free and reduced lunches. And now that I knew the income standards of what that meant, I realized why my school provided me with those kinds of services, why I had an additional tutor sometimes for reading that was provided to me probably through a Title I fund. But you know what I didn't know as a child? I didn't know that I was a struggling kid because no one ever told me. You know what my teachers told me instead? They told me that I could be something great. They told me I was becoming a better reader. My 8th grade English teacher, Rita Owen, pulled me aside and said, "Will, I think you should go into advanced English next year because you become such a good writer." And little did she know that that moment was the inspiration for what I would do later as a teacher. You have the opportunity this year to pack parachutes, and you're doing it in ways that you have no idea. I was telling my daughter one day as we were driving back from school that sometimes it's really weird when you recognize your own story to know how to tell it in a way that doesn't sound self-promoting. And she said to me, "Dad, that won't be a problem as long as you give credit to the people who deserve it." And so this is where I always get emotional, so I have to get a drink. But so every time I take a platform, I take an opportunity to thank the people who are responsible for getting me here, that were responsible for helping me become a teacher and an administrator and someone who's been able to have a career that I've loved. And that's Rita Owen, my 8th grade English teacher. It's Charles Kate, my my principal who would play basketball with us at lunch and come do art with us during the school day. It's Desmond Adams who taught me mathematics, but also he taught me about life and integrity and determination. And this year, you're going to have kids in your classroom who are going to be looking at you, and you're going to have no idea that you're teaching them more than math and science and English. You're teaching them about life. Which brings us to our last area, which is the legacy that you're leaving behind you. You know, John McCain was asked before he passed away, how do you want to be remembered? And that great senator, that former pilot himself who'd been a captive of war, said, I want my tombstone to say he served his country, and I'd like them to add the word honorably. I don't want to be morbid, but have you ever thought about what you want on your tombstone? Because I think what we want others to say about us is important. And so as you think about this school year, I want you to consider these things about your own legacy. First, I'm going to say two things that sound very contradictory. Are you ready? You are not as important as you think. Now, I'm going to follow that up in just a moment. But the reason I'm saying that is this. Sometimes we step into our work and we think that what we're doing is the most important thing in the whole universe. It's not. It's important, but it's not the most important thing. And sometimes we give ourselves way too much credit, and we think this school could not exist without me. It will. It will exist without you someday. Someday your students they're going to remember you, but that school will move on, and you'll become a faded memory in the time and the place that school existed. And that's just the way life works. So give yourself the moment of reality to realize, hey, I'm not the most important thing in the world, and stay humble. But two, you are more important than you think. How can I say both of those? I can say both of those because on the one hand, humility is important, but on the other hand, recognizing that every single moment you have with a child matters because they remember your attitude as much as your words. When they go home at night and they're at the dinner table with their families, they talk about you. Did you know that? You know why I know? I have 4 kids. And they talk about you. And guess what they talk about? Very seldom is it about the content. It's almost always about your attitude or your whatever that funny thing you said that day, or the way you inspired them, or how angry you were, or how unfair they felt that was. Those are the things they talk about. And so ask yourself each day, how am I moving the needle with my kids every hour, every time of the day? How am I moving that needle to push them in a positive direction? Relationships are more important than outcomes. Because guess what happens when we invest in positive, healthy relationships? We have better outcomes. And so stay connected to each other and to your students and to your communities this year. Stay committed, no matter how hard this pandemic gets, that you're going to stay trustworthy and loving and forgiving and determined to take care of kids. Accept that you both inspire and disappoint. Forgive yourself when you mess up. And be willing to stand in front of your kids or your faculty or your peers and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Will you forgive me? When I learned that lesson as a teacher, it changed the way my classroom management happened. Because when I messed up and I admitted it, guess what that gave my kids permission to do? It gave them permission to admit when they messed up. And finally, last but not least, you never arrive, but please keep learning this year as well. I want to wrap up. I'm not going to take time for this question because we're almost out of time, but I do want to just give you permission, and this is in an epilogue in the book, so if you want to grab a copy, I want to give you yourself permission to have joy in the journey, because you know that if you don't find places to laugh every day, then you're going to burn out. So I want to just end with one of my favorite stories. One day, Jack and Katie, my 2 youngest, came home from school. And where we lived in our neighborhood, we were close enough to the neighborhood school where they went to K-5 that they could walk to school. And so it was so much fun to see them get up in the mornings, put on their backpacks, and head out the door. And Mr. Charlie, who was the crossing guard, stood out every morning to greet them on their way up the hill. And Mr. Charlie loved to talk so much that Jack started leaving for school early because he was afraid he was going to be late because of how much Mr. Charlie liked to talk. And so Mr. Charlie would, every morning would see him, "Hey, Jack, how are you? And who's your new girlfriend? And if you pay your mom $1, she might drive you next time." And so he'd always have these long conversations with Jack. And then, of course, on their way home, it was Mr. Charlie who met them on the way back across the street. And one day I came home from school, and Jack and Katie were waiting for me, and they were just beside themselves. And they said, "Dad, Mr. Charlie was not at his spot after school." And I thought, this must be serious because they're serious. And I said, "What do you mean?" They were like, "We got to the crosswalk, and there was no Mr. Charlie," which meant that this had never happened before. And I said, "Well, how did you get home?" And they said, "Well, we didn't know what to do. So we just all started building up on the sidewalk, kid after kid after kid. And we were all standing there looking because we'd never crossed without Mr. Charlie." And so Katie says, so we're standing there, and all the kids are building up in this big crowd. And finally, this kindergartner says, "Who's the oldest?" And a fifth grader raised her hand and said, "I think I am." And the kindergartner says, "You say go first and we'll follow you." And so Jack said, these kids, they all held hands. And the fifth grader said, 1, 2, 3, go. And they ran across the road yelling, "We're gonna die!" This year, I want to just encourage you guys to take moments to capture those, because you have them every day. Celebrate those moments. Turn your problem solving into puzzle solving. Build up things that are falling apart. Stay mindful while you're learning. Take time to connect and find humor in the craziness of your kids, and engage in those creative, passionate things that bring you joy. And above all, this year, give yourself permission to love your students. Have a great year. Thank you.